The stakes here are about money and who controls the kind of flows of money and technology and all the things around that.
Taiwan recently held democratic elections. The island had been under pressure from China to elect a more China-friendly president and accelerate steps towards what China calls reunification. Well, that didn't happen. And now the world is watching to see China's reaction and what the US will do if China takes military action against Taiwan. Today, I dive deep into the serious implications of this potential conflict with Elbridge Colby of the Marathon Initiative. He's the author of The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. He has a long history of public service, having held several high-level posts at the Department of Defense, and he's widely acknowledged as one of the country's top thought leaders on U.S.-China policy. I'm Ed D'Agostino. Welcome to Global Macro Update. Elbridge, it's great to see you. Thanks for taking some time to join us. Taiwan's elections recently passed. I think a lot of people are sort of holding their breath and wondering what's next. What were your expectations sort of right after hearing the results of Taiwan's election? What do you think those results mean? And what do you see happening over the next, sort of in the short term? What do you see happening next with China?
Well, thanks a lot, Ed. Great to be with you. I mean, I think my initial reaction was more or less what I had expected, which is kind of buckle up. I mean, I think the elections were a bit of a mix in the sense that Lai Ching-te, the William Lai, the DPP candidate, was elected president, but in the legislative yuan, they have a divided system. The DPP lost its majority, and I think the KMT and the third party TPP may have a majority, although I think that's yet to be determined. But a little more mixed picture there. But you know, the election of Lai is a pretty resounding signal from the Taiwanese population. Obviously, they're voting on multiple things, you know, local economy, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a pretty resounding signal from the Taiwanese population of sympathy for at least, you know, the DPP kind of more. I mean, China accuses Lai of being a pro-independence. He sort of denies that, at least in a practical sense. But certainly that the people on Taiwan are not voting for peaceful unification or anything like it, because, by the way, the Kuomintang and the TPP, the other parties, were not favoring, you know, unification with the mainland. And so what I think that means is that peaceful unification, the Journal was saying this itself just the other day, you know, you'd have to be borderline delusional, I think, at this point to think that that's a sort of a near-term reality or even medium-term reality for the PRC, at least unification in any meaningful sense. And that, I think, is going to unfortunately make the military option that Beijing has been assiduously developing and the, you know, economic resilience and other things along with that more attractive, unfortunately for us and for Taiwan. Short term, to your question, Ed, I think anything is possible. I think we are already in the window in which China could make a military move. And there are reasons to think that things could get more turbulent and bumpy in 2024, even bumpier than they already are in late 2023. But, you know, as former Secretary of Defense Harold Brown put it, starting a war with the United States over Taiwan would be a cosmic roll of the dice for China. It doesn't mean they're not going to do it. In fact, I think it is quite possible. But it means they're going to really want to have their ducks in a row. And I think that's where the short term, you know, we may still have a bit of a respite. I just hope we use it well.
So here's where I think it gets hard for the average American. I was speaking with lots of people for the days leading up to this discussion with you, who don't focus on geopolitics all the time.
Normal human beings.
Yeah, it's hard for them to get right. You've got an island that, looking at the map, it looks to be right off the coast. Looks like it's about the size of New Jersey, right? 23 million people. It's hard, I think, for a lot of Americans to understand why would we get involved in that? What is the layman's answer to that?
It's a very natural, and I would say more than natural, it's a reasonable and important question. Actually, one of the things that when I did my book, I was really thinking about this question. And actually, you know, he's definitely not everybody's cup of tea, but I mean, I think, you know, Tucker Carlson's question to President Trump Why is it worth defending some of these NATO allies? That actually deserves a really serious answer. And if you go back to the history of the Cold War, there were attempts to provide serious answers for that. And the American people, and I believe this morally, but also strategically and politically, if it's going to have a lasting effect, there has to be a good answer to that. And what I would say to you, Ed, and to all the people asking that question very reasonably, is it's not about Taiwan. Like Taiwan alone, look, we can admire what Taiwan has done as democracy, TSMC, a thriving economy, a model society in so many ways. But I'm sorry, but that's not enough to ask thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of Americans to die. It's not enough to spend hundreds of billions, trillions maybe of dollars and really, a body blow to our national economy. I just don't, because my view is, the purpose of our foreign policy is not some global rules-based international order. It's not to spread freedom in every corner of the world. It's not to end evil. Those are all noble things, but I look at actually foreign policy should be run more like a business, a business that's successful, but also not crazy where it's making too many risky investments. So it goes bottom up. And so, the foreign policy people, in my view, should be acting more as like fiduciaries. And that means it should be in the self-interest. And there's nothing, in fact, it's actually moral. It's right for our foreign policy to be oriented on what's in the interests of regular Americans. That is the purpose of our system of government, of a republic. It's the common welfare. We are not a royal dynasty that's going to spread, a religion or communism or whatever. We are a republic, and it should be, as the Constitution says, for the common welfare. Okay, that all said, what's it about, brass tacks? It's about our economic security and prosperity at home. And because those are important enough to fight over, in my view, because they matter so much for people's lives, but also our freedoms, because freedom is inseparable from your economic situation, practically speaking. And the reason why that is at stake is because this is not about Taiwan. This is about China wanting to dominate Asia and dominate in a way that it becomes the center of the Asian economy. And from that position, the global economy, because everybody who works in markets knows Asia is the ascendant center of the world. There's all this geopolitical attention on Europe and the Middle East, but if you're a market actor, obviously Asia is where the growth is. It's where economic productivity at scale is, et cetera. That's the center of the game. So geopolitics, people sometimes think geopolitics is something from like pre-World War I era, a bunch of aristocrats with monocles. No. Geopolitics is important for republics, for prosperity, because the Chinese, by the way, this is not like some crazy fever dream of the Chinese. It's actually rational for them to pursue what I think of as a secure geoeconomic sphere. Why? Because they think that they are being, this is Xi Jinping's own word, they think that we are attempting to strangle and contain and suppress their future growth through the impositions of sanctions, through decoupling, et cetera. And they don't believe the rhetoric on de-risking. They're looking out in the future, and they're making a prudent, secure assessment. And they're saying, I think what they're saying is, we can't allow the Americans to control our ability to access markets. And that goes from natural resources, but it also goes the ability to sell into and source from places like ASEAN, East Asia, South Asia, India, and then farther afield, ultimately the Middle East, Europe, Latin America, Africa, and ultimately North America. So I think that's what they want. It's actually a rational goal. They're building a military to do it, which is a very costly signal if you're a market actor. Don't look at what people are saying. Look at what they're building the capacity to do, because that's much more telling for multiple reasons. That's why it matters, because the Chinese, I think, are moving that direction. And if they secured that hegemonic sphere, they would, others are going to be more sophisticated in describing what this means, but I think we can actually already see it because the Chinese are already doing it. They're going to move the center and the commanding heights of the global economy to their own country. Why? Because why wouldn't they? That's great. And I think we've all seen over the last generation that, I'm sorry, but Tom Friedman and Bob Zoellick were wrong. The world is not flat. If one side is actively practicing kind of mercantilism, they can take your entire industrial base, not entire, but the vast majority of it. So we've already seen this movie. We do not want to go to the much worse sequel. And so that's what this is about. The key, though, Ed, is that Taiwan is part of that story. It's not, if we lose Taiwan, which is possible, it would be a disaster, but we could still survive. So we need to drive down the cost and risk of defending Taiwan and basically in the service of supporting this coalition to block China from achieving that goal. And that's what we haven't been doing in the last few years. And that's what Taiwan hasn't been doing, including the DPP government that William Lai is leading, is a lot more, it's all hat, no cattle kind of problem, where there's a lot of talk about democracy and freedom and the global blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, if the Chinese make a military move, all that global stuff ain't going to matter. It's going to be whether or not they can use force to defend themselves alongside us.
The big question for me after hearing that is, are we on a collision course with China? We being the U.S. I mean, we both sort of have similar worldviews, different perspectives, but same end goal. So does that put us on a collision course?
Yeah, I think we're on some kind of a collision course. I mean, I think that's actually a pretty good way of putting it. Now, just because you're on a collision course doesn't mean you're going to hit the iceberg or the other ship. But we're heading towards the iceberg, or we're heading towards the other ship, since maybe it's better to think of the other ship as being controlled by a rational, intelligent actor as well. I really try to avoid making specific predictions because I don't have a crystal ball. But I think it's hard to imagine getting out of the 2020s without either a military conflict with China or a very serious crisis along the lines of the Berlin crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, basically under the shadow of the potential for military conflict. And that's because based on my read of China's incentives, its overall aspirations as they are stated and revealed, like wanting to unify with Taiwan, like wanting to create a secure geoeconomic sphere in the face of being strangled allegedly by us. If somebody's using the word, if you're saying you're being strangled, that's the word Xi Jinping has repeatedly used, then military force, self-defense, right?
Right.
Like that's not murder, that's self-defense, right? So people say, oh, they would never go to war, it's too dangerous. Well, if you think you're being strangled, and by the way, Bloomberg had this analysis earlier in January about how much it would cost the Chinese economy if there's a war. The huge assumption was that everybody would go along with these punishing economic sanctions, which is a huge and I think false assumption if the Chinese are successful. Because the sad fact of the matter is war can pay. Sometimes war doesn't pay. It didn't pay for us in Vietnam. It did pay for us in the Mexican War. Is it paying for Israel right now? I don't know. It did pay for Israel in the Six-Day War. And sometimes your alternatives are worse. United Kingdom, America, Soviet Union suffered a lot in World War II, but it was better than the alternative. So that's the sort of situation that we're in, and China's clearly developing a military to do that. So the key thing is, even though this geopolitics stuff and military stuff isn't what market people are, it's hard to calculate. It seems like it doesn't make sense. Like I was in a briefing a few years ago with a very senior finance Wall Street type guy. And I was talking about this kind of threat, and you could see he was just dismissing it. It was like this kind of like, Pentagon type people making stuff up. And hopefully, if anything, the Ukraine war has laid to rest that conceit. Mm-hmm. Because the stakes here are about money and who controls the kind of flows of money and technology and all the things around that.
Is this about semiconductors or does it go beyond that?
Because it goes way beyond that. Okay. If I thought this was just about semiconductors, I'd say, look, let's let it go and we'll figure it out. And our cars aren't going to work as well and our phones aren't going to work as well, but that's better than fighting potentially World War III.
Right.
As hard as that might be. But it's not, semiconductors are kind of like a purist representation, kind of a concrete representation of how significant this can be. But I think it's way beyond semiconductors.
So you're not alone in talking about how important Taiwan is. Back in 2021, the historian Neil Ferguson, who's well known to our audience, he wrote something for Bloomberg that I want to read to you. He said, losing or not even fighting for Taiwan would be seen all over Asia as the end of American predominance in the region. It would surely cause a run on the dollar and U.S. treasuries, and it would be the American Suez. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, basically. And I think the thing that I really like about Neil and admire about him is that he is looking at the problem realistically. I disagree with some of his prognoses. For instance, he's in favor of détente with China. I disagree. I think we should first build up our military strength and then pursue détente rather than a position of weakness. But to Neil's credit, the reason that he's making that argument is because he thinks our situation is so parlous and so problematic that we don't have a better option. And at least he's grappling with reality, unlike, I would say, people in the administration, but also many Republicans who are pretending that they can kind of will our way through this. I think the consequences of a law, and this is why it's much more than about semiconductors or the end of the Chinese Civil War. It's not about the Civil War for us. It is for the Chinese partially. But this is about, look, if Taiwan falls, it's going to radically reset expectations in Asia. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, India, Australia, etc., they are making bets about balancing China with the United States based on an assessment of U.S. strength. They're saying, I can stick my neck out because the Americans are strong enough to stand up to the Chinese, that if it's really put to the test, they'll do well enough. You know, we understand that this is not the American century Henry Lou style anymore, but, you know, there's going to be more balance. But they get that. But if Americans are defeated by China in a war, then if you're in the Philippines or South Korea, or let alone Hanoi or Bangkok or Jakarta, you're going to recalibrate and you're going to say, well, wait a minute, I had miscalculated, I misjudged, and now I'm going to make a different decision. One option is then to like really step up and be anti-China, but that's very, very dangerous. And none of these countries can do that on their own, and they're not closely linked. The alternative is to sort of cut a deal with China, and I think that would be the more likely outcome. So the problem with losing Taiwan is our policy is going to have to become even more extreme in the wake of that to compensate for that loss and those perceptions.
Going back to Neil Ferguson, one other thing that he said was he likened a military situation in and around Taiwan to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And his point was Taiwan is off the coast of mainland China. The natural response would be, even if it's not an attack, there would be a blockade of the island of Taiwan, in which case the United States would have to decide if it wants to run that blockade and run the risk of serious conflict. And that was the exact situation that Russia and the U.S. were in, except reverse, right? Where Russia had to send a fleet across the world and try to run our blockade. And it didn't work out too well for them, which is not his point, I think, was that's not a great setup for us, at least at this point.
I actually think an invasion is a better strategy for China. I don't think the blockade is a very smart strategy, because I think given the stakes I just described, if they try the blockade, we are likely to run it. We're going to challenge it. And the political, I think, narrative will be on our side, because the Chinese will be, if the blockade has any hope of working, it has to be so tough that it could actually bring the Taiwanese people to their knees. If you're just cutting off, like, I don't know, Fitbits, you're not going to bring the Taiwanese people to their knees. So it's like this sort of, you know, the problem with like a soft virtual blockade is it doesn't really do anything. It's like these gray zone and quote unquote disinformation stuff. It doesn't actually, just ticks the Taiwanese people off and makes them more likely to elect a DPP candidate.
Right.
Whereas if it's like a really serious blockade that's like starving them in the streets, people are going to be, whoa, that's pretty brutal. Then the Americans are going to have a better basis. And most importantly, in that case, Beijing will have forfeited the element of surprise, which makes an invasion harder. So it makes the escalation from there, because an invasion, and I go into this in my book if people are interested, as Napoleon said, if you want to take Vienna, don't mess around. And this is where I disagree with Neil on the assessment. Actually, Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Pacific, has said something similar about the blockade. I think they'd be a blockade would be part of their strategy, but I think they would ultimately use an invasion, because that would make the most sense. You just take care of the problem. It's done. And then there's a fait accompli. And then the Americans are saying, oh, we can't let this stand. But then even in the United States, they're the people that Xi Jinping spoke to in Northern California. Bear in mind that Xi Jinping didn't actually want to have a meeting with President Biden. What he wanted to do was speak to the business leaders, I think in San Francisco. Those people will be saying, look, we got to keep making money. You can't tank the American economy. You can't send inflation to 20%. And then you're going to get calls from the Prime Minister of Singapore and the president of South Korea and the president of the Philippines, who are going to say, geez, like, let's just kind of try to put this back in and reset. And that's going to be very tempting, because our options are going to be very bad.
Wow. So how able is Taiwan to defend itself? I understand this is a David and Goliath type of situation. Not even
David
close.
killed Goliath.
All right. So then, yeah,
Yeah.
is it that situation? I mean, Taiwan is a sophisticated, wealthy
Yeah.
island, very tech oriented, and they've been buying arms from the United States for years. How able are they to defend themselves?
Well, they can't do it by themselves, but as the, to paraphrase the expression, America will help those who help themselves. So it's pretty straightforward. The Taiwanese, they are not prepared at all relative to the scale of the threat. I would say I judge their behavior to be borderline suicidal at this point, because they are electing political leaders who provoke Beijing, fairly or not, without actually accompanying that with a military buildup. That's just because it makes them more directly vulnerable, and it makes the Americans less likely to help them, because Americans are going to say, like the people you were talking to, Ed, why are we helping people who aren't even willing to help themselves?
Sure.
Which is like totally reasonable, right? So the thing they need to do, actually, I'd prefer they talked less about the, public side and tick off the Chinese less, actually. But really, the main thing is to dramatically build up their military capability, because then they'll be able to hold off the Chinese better and enable our military to help them, right? And at the same time, the Americans will say, well, hey, I mean, look at the case of the Ukraine. To me, Taiwan is much more important than the Ukraine. That's why I've been helping, focusing on Taiwan. But you have to admire the Ukrainian self-defense, and that's inspired a lot of Americans. So the lesson there is, hit the gym, really, really, like a lot. And so, the Taiwanese say, well, we've increased defense spending by 30%. Their defense spending is much lower proportion than that of the American people. I mean, we don't face an real existential threat. They do. I mean, to me, if I were on Taiwan, I'd spend 10%. And people say, oh, that's crazy. It's like, is it crazy? Is it crazy? Because Xi Jinping has said that he's not going to let this go to future generations. This has to be resolved. And it's not idle talk, because he's building a military to do it. He's preparing his economy. So who's crazy?
Are we putting the pressure as a government, and as our diplomatic forces putting the pressure to make that happen?
No.
Yeah.
No, and we're not. And that's something that has to change. And it's a whole approach to our allies that has to change. The way I put it, Ed, is people say, oh, we've had this system since 1945 or whatever, the post-war era, and there's discussions of changing that. And it's like, no. What we are operating now on, as you could think of, is the post-Cold War policy. During the Cold War, we had a very disciplined, relatively speaking, varying degrees of discipline, but a basic focus was containment. That was our strategy. We had the free world side, but we were basically willing to work with a lot of countries, many of whom had a pretty checkered record, who were opposed to the spread of communism, particularly associated with the Soviet Union. We even worked with Mao Zedong, right? We even kind of winked at the Khmer Rouge, not our proudest moment, but we were willing to do that. At the same time, we had all those allies. We gave those allies help. Honestly, like the West Germans, when Lyndon Johnson basically in the balance of payments crisis basically charged the West Germans for the privilege of having American forces on their territory. So we gave them a hard time and when you look at what President Eisenhower was saying, the Mr. NATO, if you will, I mean, who's more transatlantic alliance guy than Dwight Eisenhower? He was saying we're not supposed to have hundreds of thousands of American troops here long term. The Europeans need to defend themselves. Both because he thought it was fair, but also because he didn't think the American people would support it. And that's why this was a big issue during the Cold War, this burden sharing issue and making sure the allies, and they did. So, the proportion of spending, for instance, within NATO by the Europeans was much higher in the alliance versus the United States than it is today, despite the fact that there were many fewer European states in NATO at the time. For instance, the West Germans had a huge military. So, and the Taiwanese spent a lot on defense. They had a pretty significant military. In fact, in many ways, they outmatched the communists until relatively recently, the mainland forces. So I think that we are going to have to put intense pressure, and because we have to rectify this post-Cold War situation, when we kind of behaved as the global liberal hegemon, the scholar Robert Kagan at Brookings Institution puts it, as we're essentially the world's policeman. We fight the jungle, as he puts it. And don't worry, we've got it. We're the pacifier, and that's just not going to cut it. We can argue about whether it's fair. I don't think it's fair, but more importantly, it's just not from a business perspective. You can't do it. It's like maybe in 1985 you could afford first class, transatlantic flights to London for your business meetings. Well, you got to cut costs at a certain point, and the other side's got to put up their part of the bargain, and that's the sort of world. And I think we're gonna. I mean, with Taiwan, we almost face a fork in the road. Whereas, like, if they don't really step it up, it may become indefensible, and we may need to contemplate a future without Taiwan, which would be a disaster. Wow. But if the alternative is a futile and failing war that is very, very costly, we can't countenance that either.
So what does the rest of that region look like then, Rich? I mean, specifically the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, are they spending at a level that makes sense?
No, I mean, the ones who are probably the best off are the South Koreans, because they've maintained the focus on the North Korea threat. And so they spend a pretty healthy proportion, I think around 2%, but they also have a strong and institutionalized military, but also defense industry. So we actually had to ask them to give us artillery ammunition to provide to the Ukrainians, because we couldn't provide it ourselves along with the Europeans. Japan is way behind. They're patting themselves on the back for moving to 2% by 2027, which is the year that Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan. By the way, that they might do it before that.
Right.
And by the way, once you start spending money on military issues, it takes years and years for it to pay off. The Australians are pretty good, but they could do more. India is very strong, has a very capable military, pulls its own weight. The Philippines has a lot of challenges. I think what they've been doing under the Marcos government that's been very encouraging is working with us on some of the basic issues. And I think they're making good progress.
So bottom line for investors' perspectives, what I'm hearing you say is that if Taiwan falls, as an investor, it doesn't mean that maybe your investment in TSMC is at risk. I
think it would be. I think we should destroy it
at a minimum.
Yeah.
But it's the ripple. It's that the entire region is now potentially under soft influence, if not direct influence, of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
That is going to change how business is done and how investment is made throughout the entire region, throughout all of Asia.
Exactly. I think there's often an implicit assumption in a lot of people, back of people's heads, maybe it's explicit, is that this Taiwan thing, like if it falls, the thing will kind of reset and then life will go on. The Chinese will have gotten their thing and then they'll behave normally. That's not going to happen. Most probably because the Chinese, if they win, rationally are going to say, well, why don't we keep seeing what we can get? And that doesn't mean territorial annexation. It means that they are going to seek to expand their influence. By the way, if there's a war about Taiwan, it's not going to be narrowly confined to Taiwan. It's going to be a regional conflict. And if they defeated the Americans, who's going to stop them from putting their thumb on the Philippines? And then, by the way, basically establishing total control over the South China Sea, and ASEAN being then in a position in Southeast Asia where they have very little recourse. And then also, there's no way that we can assume, the Americans and the Japanese and others, the Australians, that the Chinese are just going to stay there. Even if they say, they might mount they might, as part of the fait accompli strategy that's designed to appeal, say, to some of these people Xi Jinping was talking to, and they're saying, hey, look, we took care of this. It's over. Just let's reset everything. We can't trust them at that point. Clearly, we don't trust them now. They don't trust us, but we can't trust them. We're going to have to pursue a much more aggressive balancing strategy and military buildup, the Japanese especially, but us as well. In which case, Asia is going to become much, much hotter even than it already is. And by the way, that's in the context of a war where a lot of Americans will have been killed and so forth. I actually think trade will continue. I mean, I think this notion of economic decoupling, in some ways it's desirable, but I just don't see it happening really. There hasn't even been decoupling really from Russia. In the case of Europe, it's often intermediated, but a lot of the decoupling that's happening in the last couple of years seems to be with intermediation in places like Southeast Asia. Now, obviously there's some of it happening, but if we actually need each other, trade's going to continue. But the point is that trade can continue even in the context of a war, which is what Ukraine and Russia were trading, basically.
Rich, I think you did a great job of kind of putting it into context and giving us good perspective on what's happening in Taiwan. I want to continue this conversation with you in a part two. And
Okay.
part two, I want to get into the strategy of denial and sort of where we're at today globally. Join us next week for part two of my discussion with Elbridge Colby, when we'll get into the state of America's defense readiness, flaws in our foreign policy, and how we can absolutely avoid conflict with China. Before you go, be sure to subscribe to our channel. I'm Ed D'Agostino. See you next week.